Good afternoon or good day to everyone joining us today for this last of the Ubuntu Dialogues events with the Seminar Exchange Fellows. I can't believe we have come to this. Since 2019, we have been busy with this Ubuntu Dialogues project, and this is the last of our webinar seminar series. My name is Mariki Olofsson. I'm the project manager for the Ubuntu Dialogues project here at Stellenbosch University, and I'm really delighted to be here in person with Dr. Priscalia, Khosa and Dr. Precious Simba, who will talk to us about their work and how they think about their work with a lens of Ubuntu. Welcome to the two of you, more about the two of you later. I also want to welcome you to this event on behalf of my counterpart at Michigan State University, Dr. Upenyu Maji, and the principal investigators on the project, Professor Jamie Monson at Michigan State University and Mr. Bongani Mgijima at Stellenbosch University. This webinar is really the 16th event featuring 2 of 24 Ubuntu Dialogue Seminar Exchange Fellows, 12 from Stellenbosch University and 12 from Michigan State University, who have participated in this project since 2019. For those of you who are not familiar with the project at this point, just a brief description. The Ubuntu Dialogues project is a collaboration between Michigan State University and Stellenbosch University in South Africa. The lead department at Michigan State University is the African Studies Center, and at Stellenbosch University, the project is hosted by the Stellenbosch University Museum. The Seminar Exchange Program is one of 3 components of the project. Apart from the seminar exchanges, the Ubuntu Dialogues project also involves a student graduate fellowship, of which Dr. Simba was also a part in 2019, was it? And then also a series of conversations between students from Stellenbosch University and Michigan State University. Project is concluding the current phase of its activities with a conference in Stellenbosch at the end of October, where we will start the process of revisiting the work we have done since 2019 and challenge ourselves to rethink and reimagine the richness of Ubuntu and how its values could inform how we think about transforming the societies we live in through different forms of dialogue, talking and thinking with one another across differences and diversity. I will say more about this conference at the end of today's webinar, and please visit our website as well for updates on sessions that will be open to the public. We do hope to see you there in person and hopefully also virtually. I now want to turn to Dr. Khosa and Dr. Simba here next to me. I have been lucky enough to know these 2 remarkable women for a while now, and the thing that strikes me about them is their commitment to think about Ubuntu as something that should be concrete and visible. In her work as lecturer in social work at Stellenbosch University, Dr. Khosa is grappling with how Ubuntu becomes a measurable component in the supervision frameworks used by social workers. As a value, Dr. Khosa told me in a conversation, Ubuntu could easily get lost in a framework that prescribes targets and numbers. It is not good enough to think of Ubuntu as something that will trickle down, Dr. Khosa said to me. It has to be an integral, measurable part of an intervention that prescribes a certain relational approach to the service. Dr. Simba, who lectures in the Department of Education Policy Studies here at Stellenbosch University, has been thinking about Ubuntu for a long, long time. And it has been part of her 2021 thesis, a feminist critique of Ubuntu, implications for citizenship education in Zimbabwe. Like Dr. Khosa, Dr. Simba wants to think of Ubuntu as more than a moral framework. The way we think about Ubuntu is the problem, she told me. Ubuntu is not abstract in its origin. It comes from somewhere. I feel very lucky to have this conversation with the two of you today. And I'm going to ask the two of them about their work, how Ubuntu and where it features in their work, and how they think of Ubuntu as a way of being. And after about 45 and 50 minutes, we hope that you will join this conversation. To make things easier, I would like to ask you, the people who have tuned in and who are joining us virtually, to post your questions in the Q&A feature rather than the chat feature of this platform. And feel free to introduce yourself and to have conversations with others in the chat feature. So I'm going to start with our conversation, and I want to start, Precious and Priscalia, with a little bit of a personal question. To go back perhaps to the question of how the two of you started your journey with Ubuntu. How did it first feature in your personal lives, and how did it then came to be part of your professional work? Maybe Priscalia, if I can start with you.
Of course. Good afternoon.
Hello.
And good afternoon to the audience who have joined us online. It is amazing to be sitting with those ladies this afternoon and reimagining Ubuntu, as you have said in your introduction, Marik. I will start with my personal journey with Ubuntu. I think for me personally, it is who I am and what I do as a social worker first, as an academic second, but also thirdly as a resident head. So I don't want to go back to being a social worker, my experience with it as an academic, but I want to particularly focus on a personal level in terms of my role as a resident head and relate it to an incident just happened this morning wherein I saw students and staff literally leaving.
And just perhaps to explain to those who are not familiar, you're a resident head at one of the residences here at Stellenbosch.
Yes, that's correct. So I want to provide a personal example on that because you're also asking about our personal journey with Ubuntu. So I won't focus on other roles and how personally I've lived that. But this morning, I'm a resident head of SONOP, one of the female residences in Stellenbosch University. We got a bomb threat scare wherein the residents had to evacuate immediately, urgently so. Obviously, throughout the chaos, what was amazing for me to observe, with my interaction with students and staff, is the ability to support and live Ubuntu in real life, wherein students were reaching out to each other to support one another in time of need, figuring out what support they can get in that time and period, because obviously we are also in the week of assessment, so students were also panicking and worried about that. But I think getting support from students and from fellow students and staff, I think that was helpful for students. We had to evacuate to and get a different space in our neighboring residence, Irene, where we were welcomed by fellow students, by staff, supporting each other in need in that. So for me, that was Ubuntu life, It didn't have to take somebody to write a textbook, to reframe, it really happened, and I think that is what we need in our society, though we hardly see that, or we only see that in very few instances. So on a personal level, that was the experience, and I do think it was really amazing to observe and note that. And then on a professional level, or rather in my work, because my research focuses primarily on the supervision of social workers. So what my study found was, because I think you also mentioned that, Mariki, in your introduction, in terms of how supervision has now become more of a quantity measure than a quality measure. So what I found as a gap from my research and through the conversations or interviews with the social workers and supervisor was that the relational part of it is missing. You know, and because the relational part of it is missing, then the question becomes, what needs to change? You know, what needs to happen? Where do we then foreground these relationships? And then it took me back to the concept of Ubuntu. You know, have we now forgotten our humanity, our interdependence as human beings? Because also back to the example of what happened earlier this morning, also the interdependence of individuals, to say when that one incident happened, you know, people around you don't ever get affected by whatever is happening. So also within a supervisor-supervisee relationship, that interdependency rather, is very important. So it was because of that made me interested to say perhaps this can be the foregrounding value that we introduce and instill within a supervisory relationship. And in addition to that, the International Federation of Social Workers and the International Association of Schools of Social Workers in 2021 introduced, because every year we celebrate Social Workers Day. So their theme for last year was Ubuntu as well. So it was exciting to see that also on an international audience, wherein, you know, social workers, social work educators, academics, practitioners were then invited to instill, you know, to promote Ubuntu in the different sectors in which we work with. So because my interest is not only practice but also in research, so hence that became an interest for me, for something to pursue, reimagine, and see where it can future in terms of social work supervision.
And I think what you're saying, that what you described that happened this morning at the residence, reminds me also that interdependence and in a crisis, that relational and humaneness that we count on as we relate to one another as human beings.
I guess I can jump into the conversation. I think my journey with Ubuntu, I never realized, because Ubuntu from the private personal it's not a word that we grew up talking about. It's not something that you speak to say, oh, there is Ubuntu, that is Ubuntu. We do not speak of it in that way. Ubuntu is performed, it's embodied, but it's not spoken of. So you wouldn't find it in rhetoric, right? So when I started my master's work, which is where I thought my journey with Ubuntu began, it was with a document. It's very popular in Zimbabwe. It's a white paper that was written in 1999. It was a research that was done by a panel of 11 educationist scholars, and it's called the Nzira Masanga Commission of Inquiry. A lot of people in Zimbabwe know about this document, but it was a presidential inquiry into how to transform Zimbabwe's education at the turn of the century. And the document was progressive, forward-thinking. It proposed these amazing changes on how to get quality education across the system. And literally, it was an overhaul of education from pre-primary school all the way up to university. It was a massive document. I think it's about 28 chapters. And it was proposed, everybody liked it. There were national consultations, but it was never enacted. And so it sat and gathered dust, and we talked about it, we knew it's there, but it was not put into policy. So in 2013, when I was doing my master's study, there were rumors that this document would now come back to life. And at the center of this document was bringing Ubuntu as a philosophy of education. This was what was at the heart of this document. And they called it holistic education. And I thought, okay, at that moment I was doing gender studies and I wanted to find out, so what are the gender implications of this document? How does this document envision gender and so forth? And I did a study on that. However, my reading of Ubuntu, I did not problematize how Ubuntu is interpreted. I just worked with the everyday Ubuntu that we find in texts. But the more I circulated my own study and got critique, the more I realized that I had taken myself out of the conversation of my own research, my own experience with Ubuntu, what it means to engage in these interdependent, interrelatedness, these forms of relationality that are enshrouded with Ubuntu. What does it mean? I hadn't problematized that. So when I started my PhD study, at this point, that document, that old document that was written in 1999, had resurfaced. It had resurrected. And now, they wanted to put it into policy. And I thought, you don't get a second chance like this. Why don't I have another go at bringing not just gender, but feminism in conversation with Ubuntu? But this time round, I don't want just to make it a simple critique of Ubuntu. I want to make it a conversation between feminism and Ubuntu. And in the process, bring myself into the study. And so I had to curate my own experiences, go back into my own upbringing, go back into how Ubuntu, even though it was not spoken of, how Ubuntu showed up in my own upbringing, how in greetings, in encounters, Ubuntu was, Ubuntu materialized. And in so doing, I found that a deeper reading of Ubuntu is required. Because taking Ubuntu to say Ubuntu is humanist, even though it makes sense in terms of language and interpretation, but in terms of understanding the archive from where Ubuntu, the people that gave us Ubuntu, it's so far removed. It becomes this, like you were saying, this abstract thing that has, no provenance. But Ubuntu has provenance. There are so many people across Southern Africa whose lives are defined by Ubuntu.
As you say, it comes from somewhere.
It comes from somewhere. So, exactly. So that was my starting point. That's where the journey started off.
Precious, and is that somewhere language or more than language?
It's more than language. But for me, I needed a vehicle to understand what Ubuntu, a way of unpacking what Ubuntu means. And for me, language was very useful. So when you go back to language and use language to unpack just the word Ubuntu, there is so much there beyond humaneness, beyond kindness, beyond Ubuntu is, especially when you break it into two words, Ubu and Du. Ubuntu speaks of the condition of something. So if we're going to say that root Du is also the root of a person, Umuntu. So once you start to speak about that and unpack it in those ways, there are so many layers that start to unravel and you realize there's so much more to this.
And I think you said it once, because I was thinking now about two things that you said. The one is that it's more than just about kindness. And I think we have talked about this before, that I have shared with you, that I think it's quite a radical idea. That Ubuntu is, because I think you said it before, in terms of a relationship, it means, do you care about me as question mark? So that brings us back to all of us. And then how do you care about me as? Priscalia, Precious, Mariki.
Yeah, I think when you understand that Ubuntu, beyond the observable ethic, it's an invitation into a kind of encounter, into a kind of space that we enter into beyond the human. We are trying to engage into something beyond who we are. And that's why in some texts, when you read, they talk about Ubuntu as a becoming, right? because it's more than the act of kindness or care is in your work that you're going to demonstrate. Once we get into that encounter, something more happens there, you know.
And I can quite imagine also, Priscalia, that in that relationship that you describe between supervisors and social workers that they are supervising, it is about really other human becoming more than yes.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about
Yes.
that?
Because the reason why supervision exists and it's mandated and it's recognized even within the legislation and in particular the supervision framework for social work supervision in South Africa is because of the fact that it doesn't only affect in my research I refer to what I call the ecology of supervision, because it's not just the supervisory relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee, but we have clients here. We have service users, communities that we are saving, human beings around to which we are saving, and that relationship then it's important because it can be a tool, it can be a vehicle in which as a practitioner I can be empowered so that I can better serve the service user, so that I can better serve the communities, so if that relationship perhaps is not working, or is perhaps only just how many people have you seen, without acknowledging me as Ubuntu, without acknowledging what I come with as an individual, as a practitioner. Yes, you've got your ethics as a professional. We know, that ethics that guide you as a professional, but also I'm a human being regardless of the professional ethics that I come with in my work or in my practice. So because of the integral part in which that system, which I call the ecology, plays, then that relationship then is important, and hence at the basis of that, the foundation, I believe then it should be Ubuntu. And I think, Precious, you have unpacked it even further by taking us through the history of what it means, and also the fact that perhaps, you're also speaking about languages, and I think what the IFSW also did in their call to make Ubuntu as a theme for social workers celebration, social work day celebration, it was like, listen, we are opening it up to, if I want now to use it as to because perhaps the interpretation of how we can live and become it might be different, but at least now we can name it, we can name it, and perhaps we can see it, and perhaps we can observe it. So I think that for me it was of the realization in terms of the ecology of supervision, to say it's not only about the supervisor or the social worker, there are service users also involved in that. So hopefully that positive relationship could hopefully trickle down to the service user, the children, the families, the communities that social workers serve.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of that part that of Ubuntu I find intriguing and challenging and so rich, is that it actually challenges us really to think about one another as deeply as, who is this person who is I'm talking to, that I'm relating to, that I need to be a citizen with, because a citizen can also very easily sound like some term that is not, but if I think of my neighbor as a citizen, and you think of as a teacher of the children in front of you as citizens, how would you think about that, Precious thing?
I think from my work on Ubuntu in education, it's when I started by troubling how we interpret Ubuntu. And I went back to understand how Ubuntu has been defined by these, primarily I used Ndebele culture and a bit of Shona culture to understand and Shona experiences and Ndebele experiences to understand what Ubuntu is. I found, before I get to your question, I found that the orientation for Ubuntu is always for the establishment of a relationship. So it's always geared towards, we engage in Ubuntu to bring people in. You know, I remember there was a joke when I was in the UK one time and talking to one professor there, and we were greeting him, and he says his experience in Africa was that in the UK they greet to create distance, but in Africa they greet to bring people in. You know, and I thought that's such a wonderful analogy. Ubuntu always wants to bring people in, those who are on the outside. If you consider how we treat strangers, how we treat passers-by, it's always to bring them in, into the fold. So to find, it's a framework that wants to create some sort of relationality between people. So even the idea of a citizen, for example, in the Ubuntu framework, it's not the citizen that we know a citizen as a partaker of or a member of a particular state, but it's a citizen as in somebody who is a member of the family. And that's what Ubuntu always wants to bring. It wants to bring you in relationship, to bring you closer. And in my study, I had the privilege of interviewing 8 teachers, female teachers. There's one particular teacher, she had been teaching for more than 30 years, and she was teaching grade 7 boys. And she would say, she was quite a boisterous woman, you know, and in this class, young boys, noisy. I think when I went to interview her, it was towards the end of the term, work is done, so they're very playful, you know, and she said, in this class, you know, she was very, you know, sometimes teachers can be very performative. In this class, I am the mother. They're all my children. Can you imagine? She has framed the type of relationship that is happening in this classroom in terms of a mother and her children.
So that brings me also, you say it's to bring people in, but what I'm also hearing is what you are saying about that teacher pupil relationship and the social worker supervisor social worker relationship. It is also about the approach of the teacher of reaching in.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think we need to acknowledge, again, we were speaking about ethics, the relationality, and all that, to say, especially in a supervisor relationship or teacher learner relationship, there is the hierarchy there. So there is already, you know, an entrenched power in terms of the supervisor, in terms of supervisor relationship, and perhaps the teacher, you know, teacher learner relationship. So the approach that the supervisor will take then is important, because it's then likely to, you know, sort of break down that power so that it's not, you know, intimidative in whatever shape or form. But then the supervisors or social workers rather can then feel, you know, comfortable enough to go to their supervisors. And if then really living by or through Ubuntu in terms of renaming that relation to say, yes, I'm here in terms of the power that has been, you know, given to me in the sense of my positionality. However, I'm here to offer this support. Am I available for guidance in relation to your needs as a social worker, so that you are then positioned and empowered and encouraged to be able to offer services to the service users and communities. And so then we can acknowledge the power, but also figure out a way to say, how do we potentially, you know, try to dismantle that structure, even though it's been given, you know, by sense of authority or power in terms of the position.
And then it becomes, I think in a previous conversation you said, then it becomes not about targeting case numbers or targets. You use a different language to describe that relationship.
Absolutely, because I think then it's more of the impact. Then we focus on the impact that, you know, the services that we provide to our clients would look like, but also the impact of the supervisor-supervisee relationship, you know.
If I can add something there, I think what I found, just to extend the story that I shared with you of this teacher who defines her relationship with her students as a mother and her children, can you imagine how easier then it becomes for care to be enacted in that relationship once she views every student in the class as one of her own? Care becomes easy. It's not something that she needs to be told, but because the relationship has been structured in that way, it's playful, almost like indeed what happens with a mother and her young children. It's playful at times, it's strict at other times, it's instructive, it's engaging. So all of the things that you would want to list as to-dos or must-haves in a class, you must be engaging, a teacher must be engaging, caring, instead of listing them as abstract values. Once the relationship has been framed in a particular way, they become almost, I don't know if the word is axiomatic, but easy to flow in between the teacher and the students, because now there is a relationship that has been defined by Ubuntu. So Ubuntu, like I was saying at the very beginning, it's an invitation into this space. So once you invite them into the space, then all of the things that we know of, say, for example, invite you ladies into a space of sisterhood. All of the things that we know of sisterhood become easy once we set up this space, this engagement, this relationship that we have in that way. So you don't need to be told, Mariki or Priscalia, to be kind, because once we frame this relationship as a sisterhood, then kindness flows more easily between us. Care, tenderness, all of those things. So those things are not Ubuntu in themselves. To be kind, to be humble, to be caring, to be honest, but the way we frame this relationship, that's Ubuntu.
I like what you are saying there, because it reminds me also then of the challenge, and I want to come to challenges just now.
Yeah.
But that challenge that if you frame this relationship with your pupils as that of being a mother, it also obviously is going to bring about challenges of what do I do with those children that I don't like, or those children that cause a problem. How do I approach that? And for me, that is where the radicality of Ubuntu comes in, because for me, that is the challenge. It is easy to be in a relationship with people that you like, but what happens when you are so diverse that you can't see me as that question mark that you, or so I want to talk a little bit about the challenges in your respective fields for shifting frameworks for policy design from merely technical tools to tools that capture values in measurable ways. And I think you both have talked about the difficulty of doing that. So values that say more about the way professionals relate to the people they work with in fundamentally humane ways. So Precious, maybe I want to start with you here. What do you think are the biggest challenges you face in that work that you are doing in thinking about Ubuntu as being part of education policies that build citizens?
There are a number of challenges, because presently, as what is happening in Zimbabwe right now, the curriculum overhaul started in 2015, when this new, when they decided to finally put into policy the original document that was written in 1999. And the process is, how do we institutionalize Ubuntu? Because systems of education are these massive bureaucratic systems. How do we allow Ubuntu to permeate those systems? Because they operate and they're structured informed by certain types of thinking. How do we allow Ubuntu to move through a system of education? And education goes beyond, a system of education goes beyond what happened in the classroom. It is, it involves government, it involves communities, involves parliament, it involves examination councils, it involves quality assurance departments. It involves a lot of things that
It's
come
an
together.
ecology, like
It's an
Priscalia
ecology,
says.
like Priscalia is saying, exactly. So how does Ubuntu then travel, maybe, so to speak, through an organization? And unfortunately, when I started writing my PhD, fortunately or unfortunately, it was at the very start of this process in Zimbabwe. So we couldn't take a step back and, and observe how it's going, even though now in 2022, they're at the end of the first phase. That will be their third phase, but anyway, I won't get into that. So they're going to evaluate their process and we're going to see how that has happened. But at that point, it was still analyzing it abstractly. But even at that point, they are knowing how organizations work. We could see certain problems. Some of these were universal problems and some of them were country-specific problems. The universal problems, the ones we're talking about, it's this massive bureaucratic institution. How do we get it to start to think in different ways, right? The second problem is how Ubuntu came about to be the philosophy of education in Zimbabwe. The talk started in around 2013, and this was after Robert Mugabe won which was to be, unfortunately, we know now, his last election. And so at the back of that, and it was a very contested and violent election. At the back of that, his party, the ZANU-PF, decided as a way of sort of solidifying his legacy. And remember, Robert Mugabe was a particular enigmatic character to whom education was tied to. It was part of his pride. So they wanted to solidify his legacy by bringing back this document. Sort of, let's change education once and for all. Let's solidify your legacy. So can you see, already we're seeing, yes, we agree with what this document by and large says, but it's already tied to the politics of the land, which are largely problematic, and then tied to a man whose legacy is even more problematic, right? And so that's how the journey started. And this was a government that was, by all accounts and purposes, was bankrupt. The first reason why it wasn't done in 1999 is because they said they did not have money. And now in 2015, when they finally decided to go ahead with this overhaul, the government wasn't in an even better position. It was worse off. So there is financing issues. There's all of these issues. So from the get-go, we could look at it and say, this is a good idea, but we can already see that this idea is going to have some issues. But to its credit, I have to say that the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education in Zimbabwe has taken on the task in incredible ways, even with such limited funding. You can see that Ubuntu, they've really tried to get it into the system of education from pre-primary school all the way up to A-level, which would be like your matric. They've really tried. But another issue, which I called from the very beginning, was the issue of interpretation. Because Ubuntu also in the original documents was defined only as humaneness. So there wasn't enough there to really trouble the system in terms of what Ubuntu can come to mean, right? So those are some of the challenges. There was the challenge of association with a very problematic government or system of government, which was the legacy of Robert Mugabe, and that is where it came from. And there were issues of financing. How are you going to overhaul a system of education when financing is already a problem? And then the issue of interpretation. But the issue of interpretation also now is twofold. So if you can just allow me. On the one hand, at the very top where policy is being written, they don't have a rich interpretation of Ubuntu. And as policies usually do, they don't even when you look at the Constitution, they don't really go deeply into interpretations unless if it's necessary and it's a contentious issue like land and things like that. They need to be very specific so that they avoid the impact. But usually policy likes to be as neutral as possible. So Ubuntu at that level is not well expanded. But when you go into the classroom, which is where policy is supposed to end, because policy is supposed to be implemented in the classroom at the school, we find that even though the policy is neutral, the actors who are sort of at the base of the system already have a nuanced conception of Ubuntu. So how do you marry the two? You have ideas of Ubuntu that are coming to change the system in particular ways, which are very neutral. But in some instances, you find that there is a rich understanding of Ubuntu that is embodied because of people of the culture they come from. But now people are different, people are raised differently. This is not even. So the teachers I speak of, even they, out of the 8, I think about 3 or 4 had a very nuanced expression of Ubuntu that they enacted in the classroom. So this differences for me I would like to see the evaluation reports coming out of maybe this year going into next year from the Ministry of Education. I foresee that is going to cause problems in how Ubuntu then moves through or travels through a system of education.
And there might then also be the risk that Ubuntu becomes politicized or being framed.
Not even I think that's a lived risk already from where it sounded, right? It was at a ZANU-PF National People's Conference, where the idea to say, let's bring back that old document that had Ubuntu at the heart of it. That's where, and it's coming off a victory that is contested. So it's something that we celebrated. We knew it's needed, but it's coming out of very murky waters, and that we knew that association might be problematic. But I must say, the Ministry of Education in Zimbabwe has really tried to separate itself from the politics somewhat. But it remains to be seen. We'll see from the evaluation reports going into next year what exactly they have done. I've tried in my own personal capacity to trace how Ubuntu is showing up in different areas of the education system. Just the other day, also last night, I was studying how examination papers, what is coming up in examination papers from ECD, which would be like your grade R, ECD all the way up to A level. And lo and behold, Ubuntu is there.
Well, I want you to talk a little bit about that in the last question, when I want to talk about what hope do we have for Ubuntu to live beyond how people use it and abuse it, because I think that also happens. So, Priscalia, I want to talk to you a little bit also about your challenges that you see. So, that you propose that it should be a value as part of the supervision framework of social workers, but you admit that that requires a shift. What is that shift, and what is the challenge in making that shift?
All right. Already the profession, we do have existing, ethics. Obviously, for social workers to practice, they need to be registered with our South African Council for Social Services and Professions. And in that, there are code of ethics to say, this is how we treat your clients, and so on and so forth. And I think then the expectation is that because we are social workers, we know the values and the ethics of the profession and the principles that should, come easily and naturally, even in the supervisory.
It should trickle down.
Right. So even in the supervisory relationship, the expectation is that how, we do have the code of ethics. Therefore, that should be a given. But I think the both of you, which you have mentioned and which I foresee and can consider also as a challenge in social work supervision, is the issue of the differences and culture, to say, how do you match that in Ubuntu, because the argument could be, but already got existing ethics. Why then this Ubuntu? Why is it necessary? Why is it relevant? And to respond to that, I want to say to Precious now to say it's more than the care and the kindness, and it's an invitation, as you have said, to the humanity, to recognize and to say, listen, I am a person, regardless of the diversity that I come with, my background, my race, my culture, whatever differences which you might not relate to, but I'm still a human being, and I think you can name it whatever you want, but the fact that I'm a human being, and in that supervisor relationship, I believe that should be foundational, to say, regardless of your professional ethics principles that as a social worker you need to comply with, but also see me as a human being. I would like to see you also as a human being, and hopefully then that will allow the relationship to be positive, and then with the positive results envisaged from that. So I think for me the resistance is in that, but already have this existing ethics and all that. But in my view, I think it goes beyond that.
And you talked about the challenge of measuring something
Yes.
that seems abstract, but yet I think, if I'm correctly, both of you actually argue that it is also something very concrete. I can't remember, one of you said that when it is there, you don't know it, but when it is not there, you know.
Absolutely, and I think what I found also in my research, because the supervisors, now talking about the role of the supervisors, is that they've got key functions that they play, which are outlined in literature, also in the supervision frame, which is educational, administrative, and support. What I found is that the focus is on the administrative one, which is about the reports, the clients, how many, that sort of overseeing of accountability in terms of the work that needs to be done. What is missing, though, is the supportive. And I think because that is missing, this is where, because we can't now see or live or feel the sense of Ubuntu. And I think perhaps to improve or to see that happening, maybe it's a matter of reimagine what kind of supervisor relationships need to happen, and I do believe perhaps through Ubuntu that can potentially, look different. And if it looks different, maybe it will even feel different. And the anticipation then is that the service delivery, and then you've got empowered, social workers who are not burnt out, who have not lost the passion, because they are recognized as human beings.
So it's a shift in emphasis, actually.
Yes.
From reports and targets.
Absolutely.
To something that says,
right,
let's make room for that relationship to flourish, to work with that.
Absolutely. And the reason why that is not happening at the moment, the literature suggested, but also the participants and social workers and supervisors who are interviewed, is that where do we get the time now? Because what I'm proposing in my research is clinical supervision, reflective supervision. Being able to have conversations with one another, because for you to acknowledge my background, my cultures, the diversity that I bring in, you also sort of need to know me as an individual in some form, shape, or whatever. Yes, we don't need to be best friends. Maybe we don't need the sisterhood that Precious is suggesting for the three of us now. But the kind of relationship that we have could perhaps assist in dealing with some of the things that social workers are confronting, the challenges that they need to to deal with in practice. So they are unable to do that because of the capacity, because of the workload. To say we don't have time to be sitting for an hour for a session and all that, because I've got 10 other people that I need to see. I've got reports that I need to oversee, so that then get lost in doing other stuff. So prioritizing, I think that can be
There isn't time for relationships. There should only be time for reports.
There you go.
We have
You've stolen the words in my mouth.
We have about 10 minutes or so before we ask the people in the audience to join us, and I do hope you will, to ask questions. And I want us to perhaps talk a little bit about the opportunities that you see, the opportunities in your respective fields, and if you see spaces that are opening up for thinking differently about Ubuntu, to think of it perhaps in real ways, not just in platitudes, but in real ways as a force of transformation. Or maybe that is too ambitious, Precious?
I think before the changes that were done in Zimbabwe, in terms of education, I know Ubuntu has been used in so many different ways in security systems and peace building and so forth. Ubuntu was an aspiration, something that we talk of in very aspirational terms. So to see this actually happen in our lifetime, in a system of education, it takes a lot. And I think we all know it takes a lot to shift organizations. It takes a lot to shift thinking within organizations. So to see one national Ministry of Education attempting to even do this has renewed our hope in what Ubuntu can do and how Ubuntu can be used. But obviously, we remain critical, and that is necessary because it doesn't mean that we are against what, or personally, as a scholar, I'm against what is happening in the Ministry of Education. It just means we remain critical because we know we can always do better. Yes. And we know that the more the system transforms, the better we can get at reaching, particularly the disenfranchised. Right? How do we allow education to reach the poorest of the poor? How do we allow education to reach people that are discounted, the other people within a society? We have to continuously push and critique our systems of education to up their game, so to speak. But I like what you said just now, that we need to make room for relationships to flourish. And this is something that I've been thinking about lately, because when we go back to, and you'll find that I continue to bounce back, and it's not that I want to bring up the emotive, the way I always bounce back to, the private, so that I want to bring out the emotive. And so, but in my work with Ubuntu, one of the things that I've tried to do is we need to also rethink the archive of Ubuntu. So our archive cannot just be the academic. Our archive we have to go back and excavate at the very ground where Ubuntu is lived, right? That is
where it comes from.
Where it comes from. So I continue to bounce back and go back in sayings, in language, in experiences. And when I think about that, in the private, and this is not just for people in Southern Africa, in the private, people, especially children, are taught not for knowledge's sake, but they're taught for relationship's sake. So you are taught, and if I go back to my own teaching, you'd be taught, oh, this is so and so. She is your aunt. Her mother is so and so. So you need to recognize those hierarchies, and it used to be so tedious as a child. But what then that means is, respect becomes easier, because now, as you say, you are taught not just for knowledge's sake, but for relationship's sake, for you to fit into a community, right? And by that, I don't mean for you to be complicit, which is some of the criticism that some people have had against Ubuntu, that it makes us all complicit. No, it makes that even where there are differences, we can still find something that allows for social cohesion, even though we're not going to be friends or familiar or get into a sisterhood. But still, there is this invitation, and I wrote this down, an invitation to recognize the humanity of the other. And this is what you said. And I thought that was a very powerful statement. And that's what Ubuntu does. that even where there are differences, we can still find something within us to bring us into relationship, no matter how limited that relationship is. Bring us into relationship, even though it's just for a brief encounter, and then we let go. And so for me, that was like, okay, so in this world where we're talking about fourth industrial revolution, we're talking about technology, we're talking about economy, entrepreneurship, education for jobs and so forth. What about, can we think about education for relationship? To allow education for social cohesion? Can we think about that? And when I think about that, that's when I see the possibilities for Ubuntu.
And I hear what you are saying, that one shouldn't dismiss the idea that here's this big institution like an education department is thinking, how do we instill this into the system? Priscalia, and you?
Yo, I think Precious has just summarized opportunities profoundly so.
You talked, for example, about the conference that you had, where Ubuntu was sort of, the focus on the theme.
The theme,
So do you think that is a sign for optimism, or an opportunity, or a space to think differently about?
Absolutely. So it was actually a theme for Social Workers Day, because as I've said, annually we celebrate that, and obviously it was encouraged that
when we
did. I know it's the third week in March every year. So the date might differ, but I think it's the Wednesday or the Tuesday of every. So it's usually the 21st, the 22nd, the 10th. I'll remind you next time. So definitely, Mariki, in terms of that, I think there is definitely opportunities and potential in it even being international and globally. Why? Because it is even part of it is. I think it was the first theme now of the global agenda for social work and social development. So there is then recognition, and hopefully, practitioners in different sectors and social work educators in practice, in particular as curation of knowledge information, because obviously it need to be written, need to be seen. So I think then that could be a potential. But also what I like in terms of some of the social work scholars who have written a bit about Ubuntu is the fact that I think recognizing that already the fact that we're having conversation about it now, that should already say something, and it can then be in the center, because as I've said, the challenge is the already existing, the ethics of care, the principles, and why Ubuntu. So if we recenter that, if we make that as a foundation, perhaps the status quo will change. There will then be reconsiderations of how do we build these human relationships, as we have said. How do we build these relationships? How do we make this life more bearable, perhaps within our working relationships and even the clients that we serve in different communities.
And the emphasis then on Ubuntu that is making that possible, and critically engage with it as well, as Precious, as you were saying, I think that element maybe, as you say, you are critically engaging with the education policy, because the fact that it is there doesn't mean that it is beyond reproach, or that it isn't used.
Yes.
We have quite a few questions, so I'm going to go to the questions immediately. So the first question, I'm just going to go from, the first question is from Gubelam G. And the question is, do we need critical incidences such as a bomb scare to demonstrate Ubuntu? Could Ubuntu not be our daily manner that we interact and handle each other with, and handle each other as human beings? Do you want me to, there are 11 questions, so should I do 3 and then you? Okay. And This is a second question is from Tukela Bekwa. And the question is, I love how the speaker is capturing Ubuntu as something not spoken of much by many, but a way of life. So that's more a comment than an answer, but maybe you wanted to say something about that. Then there's a question from Louise Heyman L. Are you referencing the Code of Ethics of the National Association of Black Social Workers in your country? So that's a direct question to you. So let me stop there, and maybe you, I think the last question is directly to you, Simba.
Yes.
You on the spot and asking to start with your responding.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the bomb scare. No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to take, that incident for people to leave Ubuntu. And I think it should be a way of doing, a way of being, a way of becoming. And I think as you've put it, and I think the theme for this is Ubuntu as a way of being, So that then it means it doesn't have to take any. So it was just wonderful to observe in that time and moment. In my research, I think to answer the question around
the code of ethics that you are referencing.
Yeah. No. I do not. I haven't looked at it. The focus has been on the code of ethics for social workers in South Africa. Because as I've said, all social workers we comply with the national guidance from our regulatory body as the council. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to look at that. Yeah.
Do you want to say something about, does it take a bomb scare to talk about Ubuntu?
No, not really. I think that was spot on. No, but again, it goes back to, I think those are the words that you shared with us in an earlier meet, where you talked about Ubuntu when it's not there. You can see when it's there, because it's not a word that says, "Oh, now I'm doing Ubuntu." No, it's a way of being.
But I think the thing about the bomb scare is that in moments of crisis, it is there again to focus on and to say this is what it looks like.
And because we've had so many, as humanity, in the past few years, we've had so many crises, and we've seen moments where, as humanity, we fell short. And that becomes, so when you see a moment of crisis and then people rise to the moment, that's actually quite a pleasing thing to observe.
Hopeful.
Yes, and hopeful. Yeah. You see. So yeah, I think a moment of crisis, yes, those happen. We've seen some that happen tragically. We see the lack of Ubuntu, or even seeing the humanity of others. But I think in this morning, like you were sharing, we saw humanity rise to the occasion.
Yes.
So.
I want to say that people should please forgive me if I pronounce your names incorrectly. There's a question from Lina Eidhoff. The question is, yes, Ubuntu is about being relational, honest social exchange. The late Archbishop Desmond Tutu talked about this, and he incorporated this in his daily life. I am because we are because I am. So again, I think a comment, but if you wanted to say something about this, please feel free. Then there's a question from ZAT Makaba. Dr. Simba, I missed your point where you said Ubuntu is not spoken about. My understanding is that Dr. Khosa's example of her experience this morning is speaking about Ubuntu. Please clarify.
I think what I was saying there is that in the moment of encounter, like what I just said now, you don't say, "Oh, now let's do Ubuntu." I think it even sounds funny in language. Ubuntu is not such a word. It's not even a word where you would say, where, especially in teaching moments, where you say, "Be kind." there's very few moments where you say in language where someone will say, "Oba Lobuntu." It's there, but we don't speak of it in that way. It's an expectation, like, and I like how you put it. It's an invitation. So in that moment of encounter, we don't speak of it, but we rise to the occasion, we experience it. And for many people, you recognize, oh, that was when you walk away from somebody who invites you that in that way. I think that's something that Archbishop Desmond Tutu would say, somebody like, you, Ubuntu, you pleasantly acclaim that this person has Ubuntu because they've invited you into that space, even though they did not declare that, oh, I'm being kind to you right now. No. Or I'm demonstrating Ubuntu to you now. So that was the difference I was saying. We don't speak of it. And certainly now, because in academic spaces, Ubuntu has, I think there's a trajectory. I think it's a scholar from, I'm forgetting, Christian Gate. He gives a trajectory of Ubuntu scholarship. And you can see from the 1980s, there is a spike. So certainly it's coming into academic discourse, so more and more we have these platforms where we talk about Ubuntu. We have schools called Ubuntu, cafes called Ubuntu cafes, so certainly we talk more about it. But again, going back to that archive of lived experience, you don't usually have in the home people saying Ubuntu. It's only in moments of crisis actually where you say Ubuntu bako buya solid. Like your Ubuntu is questionable, your humanity, because of what has happened in a moment of crisis. So it's not something that you talk about a lot. I'm sure, I hope I answered.
And I think maybe just to add on that, because going back to the very same example of, to say, so it was, because it was a sense of being that it was observable. So even when it's not, then you could then easily say to say, where is the sense of Ubuntu in this in this space? Yeah.
So there's another comment from Lina Eidhoff. Dr. Simba, I love how you unapologetically articulate Ubuntu in relation to the challenges in the Zimbabwean system. And then there's a question from Princess Sibanda. Interesting conversation. Dr. Simba, what does Ubuntu look like or feel like beyond humaneness or humaneness? Can you say there is a display of Ubuntu in a policy document, for example?
That is a good question. I think in a policy document, what we are looking for is, does policy, and this is something very new, because remember, Ubuntu, although we've been talking about it in very aspirational terms, we have not, until maybe in the 1990s, and I can really go and point to the work of Ramose, for example. That was one of the first really deeply critical pieces of work. Of course, I can go back. Stenlek Samkange and Tom Marie Samkange, for example, they also did some critical work around unpacking Ubuntu and making it clearer in academic language what it is and what it could be. So when we now come to policy, this is actually relatively new ground, where we're now taking this thing that was aspiration and then came into academy, and then now it's going into policy documents. It's relatively new ground. So we have to retrain our eyes to say, so what are we looking for? And that's a very good question. When I go into the document, what am I looking for? What I'm looking for me, is, does this document give a context that gives room for different actors within this system to reimagine each other's humanity? Does this policy do that? And how we can do that is by looking at the most disenfranchised. It's easy, like you're saying, it's easy to be kind and show care to people that you're already in a relationship with. in a country like Zimbabwe, for example, that has laws against people of the LGBTI community, can Ubuntu give us an opportunity for us to recognize, even though we do not agree with, we may not agree with their decisions or who they identify as, but does it allow us to show humanity to them? And if a policy gives opportunity for that, that's a transformative policy.
Yeah, I think that is what it's all about. Yeah. There's a question here from Yaoni Duduitsang Matsogopane. Is Ubuntu an African framework, or does it differ country to country, culture to culture? From Botswana, Areboto and a Zulu person says Ubuntu. Are they speaking of the same thing, or it has similar characteristics that change a bit depending on context? Priscalia, I think we are both going to put her on the spot since she's the person about the language.
In my scholarship, and I have to be very clear that this is how I have delineated Ubuntu, maybe. Others can see it differently. I feel Ubuntu is, if we allow ourselves to think of Ubuntu as a framework, this framework is informed by different things. I don't know how our time is. I'll give you a short story.
I'm watching the time.
I'll give you a short story. And this is something that happened to me in Zimbabwe. One year I was driving from Harare to Bulawayo, and that's about a 500 kilometer journey. In the middle, there's a town called Gweru. I stopped there. I had a little car, Polo, and somebody parked right behind me. So because the parking space was so snug, I had to close my mirrors. So I'm reversing and I'm in the blind. I'm just assuming who'd park behind me. And then I bump into something. I come out, huge vehicle, looks brand new, and I've dented this guy's fender. And immediately I know, Precious, what have you done? And it's at a fuel station, people start to gather around, people start shouting, what have you done? We know these scenes. And this gentleman comes out, who's in the driving seat. He puts his hands on his head, and I know, okay, I'm in for it. I try to stay calm. Sir, how are you? My name is Precious. I have insurance. I'm really sorry. I didn't see your car. I'm trying to. And then another gentleman who was in the passenger seat comes out, very light for the moment. It's like, hello, how are you? I'm fine, sir. Now I go back to this gentleman whose car that I've dented. I'm trying to, and I can see he's getting furious. And he's breathing like he's just, and I knew it's a brand new car. Mine is a secondhand Polo, and funny enough, I only got a scratch this big and his was dented. And this gentleman comes in who came from the passenger side. It's like, what is your totem? So in Zimbabwe, most surnames have a totem, which speaks of our lineage. And when we do that, they are common lineages.
Okay.
So we might share the same totem, even though we don't know each other and we're not even related. But because of that, it becomes grounds for relationship usually. So I tell him, this is my totem. He's like, that's my totem as well. I really don't want to be rude to him, but I really need to entreat the gentleman whose car I've dented. And then he's like, Masibanda. Masibanda is mother of the Spanda clan. Get into your car and go. I'm like, no, sir, I have insurance. I think I need to call the police. This gentleman is like, no, don't worry.
Yeah.
Get into your car and go. And I'm like, no. And then after a while, this gentleman, by that time he had his arms like, he puts his arms down. Says, Masibanda. Now I'm looking between these two gentlemen. What happened? What is happening? The gentleman who was in the driver's seat, who was in the passenger seat, says, this is my nephew, my sister's son. So in Zimbabwe, your mother's relatives are very important. And this gentleman was sister to the car owner's mother. And his mother and this gentleman are of the Spanda clan. I'm also of the Spanda clan.
Yeah.
So I am in the position of his mother.
Yeah.
And he cannot stay angry at his mother.
Mm.
So in that moment, by this quirky gentleman, I'm invited into a space where I become someone's mother. I'm invited into a space where I become someone's mother. And so we have this odd relationship in a very odd space, almost a liminal space that is unreal.
And momentarily space.
It's almost like a liminal space. And I'm like, are you sure? It's like, ma'am, get into your car and go. So I was privy to the actions of a woman I did not know. Right? And why I'm saying this to explain this way, had I been in Botswana, the engagement, the encounter, and I'm forgiven on the basis of someone's mother that I have no relationship with. But because we get into this encounter in a particular way, I embody her. And so forgiveness is easy for him. He can forgive me. Even though I dented his brand new car, he can forgive me. But when I leave that encounter, I'm no longer his mother. You see? So that becoming. But if I was in Botswana, or the script of relationship is different, but the framework is still the same. So that's why people from different places, Zulu people, Khosa people, Bedi people, they can recognize Ubuntu, even though sometimes there are subtleties that are different. Why those subtleties? Because Ubuntu works in conjunction with this social script that we have. And that's another challenge now. For when you bring Ubuntu into organizations, what is the social script? What informs our Ubuntu? And that's the deliberation we need to have in defining Ubuntu in different organizations.
But what you are explaining to me is also an example in a bit about what you are saying, that because what strikes me about your example is that you were going on the technicalities. I have insurance. Can I call the police? That's the tick boxes. But what they were doing was saying, there's something beyond that.
The relationality.
That rules this. And that's in a way what you wish to happen
in
that supervisory relationship.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a question from an anonymous attendee. Is it necessarily true that Ubuntu cannot be measured objectively? If we can see that it's not there, then we can measure it. We can argue about the matrix of measurement, but it can be measured.
That's a good point. and I think the person also makes it clear to say perhaps we need to define what measure then do we use, what tool then do we use to measure it, but also because in its sense it's abstract in terms of the relationships, because it's more of how do you feel? I mean, the way, the example that we have just said, you love to know it because obviously in a state of panic, you want to, but through the responses that you got from the passengers, then the feeling was then different. So then how then do it felt different when, there was lineage discussions and all that, but then how, if you are ticking a box, if you've got a measuring tool, where then do you place it? So I think you can see, you can feel, you can observe it, you can note it. I think it becomes challenging if you're going to quantify it now.
Well, it's also from a past conversation that I had with the two of you. Isn't the toolbox the problem?
Yes.
Our toolbox measures cases, targets, reports, policy, how is it implemented? And I think what you have been saying as well is there's also a need to revise and reimagine and rethink that toolbox. Because it isn't, what you're saying is not necessarily that it can't be measured, but the toolbox that we have at the moment is difficult.
Absolutely.
I think so. I think especially after I read a bit of your thesis, and I think that's something that comes through in your thesis to say we can think alternatively about how this supervisor-supervisee relationship can happen, and we can bring Ubuntu to help us to think alternatively. And I think in my work, it's also coming into to me when you asked how, and we were talking about this earlier, how does Ubuntu travel in an organization? Now that allows us to start thinking differently. As Ubuntu travels, obviously there are things that are in everyday life that we cannot fully encapsulate in an organization, a bureaucratic organization. So that negotiation of what do you take, what do you change, what do you transform, is very important. I think that's the deliberative process that we need. Maybe creating a new toolbox,
or adding to the existing toolbox.
So I think then those are some of the opportunities.
Yeah.
And I think to respond to that question about opportunities, to say maybe we need to rethink this tool. Is it even necessary to have toolbox also to start with it? Another study parents to rethink and reconsider.
So there's a question from Patricia Letole. How does Ubuntu balance power effectively without compromising the services? And then there's a comment from Aslam Fatah to say, excellent and very generative conversation so far. There's a comment, and forgive me again to the participants, there's a Masnoona Kamali is saying, I too love how the presenters have articulated Ubuntu as a daily, instinctive way of being and existence. My question is whether we are losing opportunities to retain Ubuntu in ourselves and towards others, considering how human interaction with social platforms and hybrid work models and online teaching has become more present and possibly the future.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think we'll start with the power one, because I think we did make reference to it before when speaking about the supervisor relationship, and I think the teacher learner relationship there, to say again back to the systems and the nature of how things are structured, in a workplace. For example, the expectation is that as a supervisor, I need to keep you accountable, for the work they do, because I need to report to the board, I need to report to the employer. So there has to be that sense of accountability. Hence, there are these toolboxes that exist, for me to report. To report to. So because of that accounting factor, then the supervisor obviously has a certain power in terms of that, because I need to keep you accountable and all that. However, what I'm suggesting is the framework and of how then do we get a supervisee accountable. Do you literally need to go and say how many cases and all? Shouldn't the approach perhaps be different in terms of viewing another person as a human being, because then that affects the work that they do, the information that you want to get out of them. So the fact is that in supervisor, the priority is obviously on the information that they need to get, but not as me as an individual, not me as a person, So I think Ubuntu then being for granted in that potentially, maybe I'll even give you better results, better impact, because then it won't be a matter of how many cases. Tell me now, I need to report, I need to do my monthly stats, and so on and so forth. So I think that can help perhaps deal with the issues of power in that relationship.
Because you approach that relationship in a different way.
Differently. Yeah, the invitation that you.
But I would
you
assume
spoke
that
about.
even in the terrain of policy studies, you get that same tension, that there's a power in creating the policy, in implementing it, in holding people accountable for that implementation.
I think within policy studies, there's always an issue of policies created under or written under a cloud of aspiration. So if you think of where policy comes from, it's written with aspiration. If you think of we the people, there's a lot of aspiration and hope with that. But policy is written with an eye of reaching a place that is far removed from where it's written. So the place where policy is written
that is not far removed,
that is far removed
far
from where
removed.
it's written.
Okay.
So when you think of policy being written, say parliament buildings, or in the case of education, it's written by WCED offices, and it has to trickle down. And I hate to use the word trickle down, all the way to a school, say like Makupula, that is here in Kamandi, in Stellenbosch. So the place where the policy is written and where it's expected to be implemented are different places. And there's a lot that happens between those two places. And as people who are in policy studies, we're always interested in the transformations that happen to policy between these two places, right? And then that's how and that's where evaluation comes in. Because after policy has been written and it has gone through its life cycle, we want to understand, did it do what we aspired it to do? And usually it's no, but did it come close? And what are the issues in between, right? And that's why within the Zimbabwean case, and that is a demonstration of power, you see, because sometimes even when a policy is well written with good intentions, the people who write the policy may not have the power to really make that policy materialize, because along the way it gets renovated, and that's a term that Aslam Fatah actually uses. It gets renovated, it gets reinterpreted, and it means something different at the point of implementation. And that's why for people like me, we're always interested in that life cycle. What is happening in between? Because that tells us where the power lies and where the tensions are, you see. With the case of this particular policy from Zimbabwe, my findings, we have a policy that's just been implemented that puts Ubuntu at the center of education. But already where it's supposed to be implemented, Ubuntu is there. There are definitions of Ubuntu that are, and pedagogies of Ubuntu that are already at play. So now my interest would be, how did this translate? Did it transform?
How did it travel?
How did it travel? Exactly. That should be a title of a book, eh? So yeah, even in policy studies, we are interested in those tensions.
We must start to wind up this lovely conversation that I'm having for the two of you. But so I'm going to, there's another question, or there's a question from Nwabisa Gunguluza, and the question is, how can we help teachers from different backgrounds who are not familiar with the concept of Ubuntu bring that relational element into their teaching of diverse students in their classrooms?
Interesting.
And I'm afraid I think that might be the questions we have time for, but let's see if we can.
I think I'll tie that to the other hybrid question from Kamali. So no one, I wouldn't say Ubuntu is an instinct, because you're not born with it. You have to be taught. You see, you have to be taught. Ubuntu, perhaps you can call them pedagogies of the private, pedagogies of the home. I know we've talked about pedagogies of care. You're taught Ubuntu from a tender age. And so if that is the case, then anybody can learn Ubuntu, you see. And that's why it becomes paramount for organizations like Ministry of Education in Zimbabwe it's important for them to make Ubuntu as explicit as possible,
Mhm.
so that for people who come outside of the frame of the experience of Ubuntu can also learn. It can be taught. It's not an instinct. It can be taught. In the same way someone can be taught to love or hate, Ubuntu can be taught.
And would you say there are also that it exists in different languages? Yes.
Yes, it does. It does. It
Absolutely.
does. Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe just on the issue of is Ubuntu maybe not lost? Is the potential of it not being lost in the hybrid form? And all that. Not necessarily, because obviously we're evolving as society, and perhaps the screen being on the other side might perhaps be different. But I think the language, the approach, the conversations, the relationality. I think, regardless of the distance or how far you are or what mode of communication I'm using with you, I don't think that really, you can lose that if it's within you, if it's embedded in your humanity and your sense of being. Space and time, I don't think will matter in that sense. That's how
Not
I
really.
view it.
Yeah.
Because if it's our sense of being, because being doesn't matter where you are or how we interact with each other.
Is it then also true maybe that conversations like these, or what you've referred to, that it has become more visible as a concept, Ubuntu? It's been talked about more. That create opportunities for thinking about, so what does it mean for me? What does it mean for you? What does it mean that we have different languages for it?
I think for me, it just the experiences we've had in the past, I would say 2.5 years, have just given a new way, a challenge for us to rethink how we can actually enact things like care. So we talked about a lot during the most intense times of COVID, of how do we enact pedagogies of care, even when we are on WhatsApp or Google Things. And this was a challenge for many, many teachers, a lot of teachers, and will continue to be a challenge for, say, people who are now explicitly using e-learning platforms as a mode of teaching and learning. We have that mandate to rethink then without this human encounter, because being present makes it easier. I can see you're smiling at me, you're inviting me. It makes it easier. But if there's a screen, it's more difficult. So we need to constantly
when it's on a
reimagine.
Twitter page where there isn't anything that
You only had, before you had only had 140 characters. How do you imagine care in 140 characters? So that pedagogy of care,
but you can see when it's not there.
You can see it, exactly. You can.
We have run out of time. I am really sorry about this, and I'm very sorry for the participants who have asked questions. I want to suggest that my email contact details are in the chat box, and so is the contact details of my counterpart at MSU, Upenyu Maji. If you want me to pass on any urgent questions to Dr. Khosa or Dr. Simba, please send them to me and I'll pass them on. I would like to thank both of you for a wonderful conversation. It was really good to talk to you as always. And I do hope, I want to just say something about another opportunity that for those of you who are able to join us, who are in Stellenbosch or close to Stellenbosch, at the end of October, we will host the first of 2 conferences that will conclude this phase of the project. The conference, Ubuntu Dialogues, Revisit, Rethink, Reimagine, will be presented at Stellenbosch, at the Faculty of Theology and at the Stellenbosch University Museum in person. But also we will make provision for virtual participation as well from 24 to 28 October. And there are 4 sessions that are public events, and I quickly just want to draw your attention to those. On Tuesday, 25 October, Professor Kupano Ratele will lead a discussion to help us consider Ubuntu as part of each of our own stories. The session called My Story, Your Story, Our Story. What does Ubuntu look like where you come from? And this session, as will all the other open sessions, will be at the Ati van Wyk Auditorium at the Faculty of Theology from 9 a.m. until 10:30. Every morning. On Wednesday, 26 October, Professor Louise de Toey from the Department of Philosophy at Stellenbosch University will help us think about Ubuntu's conversation with feminism and gender rights, a term that I stole from Dr. Simba. On Thursday, 27 October, Professor Youssef Wahid of Education Policy Studies at Stellenbosch University will help us think about Ubuntu's conversation with the politics of knowledge production. If you can, please join us. Please check out our website. The details are also in the chat file for more information about the conference program. And please join us if you can. I want to thank you all for your time today. And again, please thank you. I want to thank Dr. Simba and Dr. Khosa for being such pleasant conversation partners and for thinking so deeply about a concept that I think is very important. Thank you all for your time today and for your support throughout this project for this webinar and seminar series. And we will hope to see you soon for the rest of our activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was fantastic.
Yes.